Before I talk about these issues, let me first compliment the gentleman from Florida. He hasn't been in Congress very long, but he certainly made his mark very strongly, and particularly on the U.S.-Israel relationship. He has been a stalwart supporter and a very, very articulate spokesperson for the U.S.-Israel relationship, and I know that Mr. Deutsch has been very, very effective, and it's an honor to do this special order with him this evening. I agree, Madam Speaker, with everything that every one of my colleagues said. And let me first say, because we are Democrats having this special order, there's been a lot of fighting in Congress, but on one thing we don't fight about, Democrats and Republicans. We agree that the U.S.-Israel relationship must remain strong. And if there's one thing that unites this Congress and unites Democrats and Republicans, it's strong support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. Many of my colleagues have made very, very good points, many of which I want to reiterate. But I think the most important thing to reiterate is this. If there is a dispute anywhere around the world, the only way you can resolve that dispute is getting the two adversaries face-to-face in direct negotiations to hammer out all the issues of disagreement and hopefully come to a peace agreement. That happened in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, a place that we never thought would get peace, but did, because both sides made the commitment that they preferred peace over war and over misery that had gone on for far too long. So they sat down face to face with a little prodding from different countries, including the United States, and were able to hash out an agreement. That, I'm convinced, is the way that the Middle East difficulties will come to fruition, only by face-to-face negotiations. The Palestinians, in my estimation, have attempted to throw so many preconditions at Israel before they will even sit down and negotiate that it's made it impossible for Israel to be able to sit down and talk with them. Boundaries like 67 boundaries or settlements or expansion of neighborhoods, all these are final status issues. These are not issues where one side says to the other side, you have to unilaterally agree with our position before we'll even sit down and negotiate with you. That makes no sense whatsoever. So face-to-face negotiations are the only way that we can have peace. I would argue that going to the United Nations by the Palestinians actually sets back the cause of peace. Because if the United Nations were to declare a Palestinian state, say on the basis of the 1967 lines, which is what the Palestinians want, well, that is a guarantee that there can never be peace with an agreement like that. First of all, if the United Nations were to agree to that, no Palestinian leader in the future could ever accept anything less. And the Israelis can never accept and will never accept a return to the 67 borders, which were indefensible. Israel fought wars because those 1967 borders were not defensible. And so these preconditions and this going to the United Nations actually sets back the cause of peace. Now, I just think a little bit of history is important, because it's so easy to go on college campuses or to try to delegitimize Israel in the United Nations or to have statements that aren't really true. The fact of the matter is that Israel has always been prepared to make painful concessions for peace. I was in this Congress during 2000-2001 when President Clinton helped negotiate what we thought was a peace, the Oslo Accords, and then we thought was a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I remember in 1993 on the White House lawn with Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands. I remember being there with my 8-month pregnant wife in 95-degree weather, and we all had such high hopes. But what's happened? Abba even used to say the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And there have been many opportunities for peace. In 2000, 2001, Israel agreed to a peace. Arafat, who was the Palestinian leader, said no. And what did Arafat turn down at that time? He turned down a Palestinian state, part of Jerusalem, 97% of the West Bank, billions and billions of dollars of aid. Israel said yes, he said no. I think it's important to put that in perspective. And then the Palestinians talk about the right of return. They want to flood Israel with Palestinian refugees, not refugees that left in 1948 when Israel was founded, but their descendants. And that's a pipe dream, because that could never happen. It would undermine the essence of the Jewish state of Israel. So if there is going to be peace in the Middle East, we need to go back to what the partition of Palestine in 1948, the original resolution, said in the UN. It said Palestine is to be partitioned into an Arab state and a Jewish state. And here we are some 63 years later, and the Palestinians and most of the Arab world won't even recognize Israel as a Jewish state. That's where the problem lies. Not with Israel. And the attempt to go to the United Nations and sort of do an end game around Israel will not work. And finally, and then I'd be happy to discuss this further with my colleague from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, let me just say this, and we've heard some rumblings about it with some of our colleagues here. This Congress will not continue to fund the Palestinian Authority. It's not going to be a blank check. If the Palestinian Authority doesn't want peace and doesn't show that it wants peace, we are not going to continue to fund them. I introduced a resolution in the Foreign Affairs Committee which came for the State Department markup, which passed unanimously on a roll call vote, withholding money, ending money to the Palestinian Authority if they come to the United Nations for a vote. Passed unanimously, every Democrat, every Republican. And so this Congress is not going to be a fool. Either the Palestinians want peace or they don't. But they cannot have it both ways. They cannot say they want peace and refuse to sit down and talk to Israel face to face at a negotiating table. So, Mr. Deutsch, I want to thank you for doing this. I think it's very, very important that all people of goodwill, Democrats and Republicans, stand together in support of Israel. I think the President's speech today at the United Nations was a very good speech, where he talked about the bond is unbreakable between the United States and Israel. And we have to make sure that the Palestinians live up to their commitments. Israel is willing to live up to its commitments. Israel wants to live in peace. We're now waiting to see what the Palestinians and the Arab states want to do. And finally, let me say this. There are two factions in the Palestinians. One is Fatah, which is Abbas's faction, and one is Hamas. Hamas controls Gaza. Hamas is a terrorist group. Hamas doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Hamas certainly doesn't recognize the right of a Jewish state to exist. How can we expect our ally Israel to sit and negotiate and make peace with an entity that denies its very right to exist, and an entity whose whole reason for being is to destroy the Jewish state? We wouldn't ask that of ourselves. We shouldn't ask that of Israel. And I yield back to Mr. Deutsch, and I'd be happy to do a colloquy with him or anything he might like.
I thank the gentleman. First, before engaging that, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Engel, if the Palestinians were serious about peace, they would abandon their unity with Hamas. They would abandon this plan to move forward at the United Nations, and they would return to the negotiating table. But this doesn't seem to be the case, as we've discussed here tonight. They seem intent on, in fact, making a mockery of the United Nations by using it as a platform to delegitimize Israel. But we will stand up to that effort. We'll stand up against it. And the fact is, from the vile Zionism is racism resolution of the 70s to the biased and misleading Goldstone report, the United States has time and time again stood up against such delegitimization efforts, loudly voicing our opposition and declaring that we won't tolerate such bogus and malicious accusations. And we'll stand up again for Israel this week in New York, but not just today and Friday. I'd like to take a moment to talk about what's going to be happening tomorrow, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad brings his campaign of hatred to the United Nations General Assembly, as he stands just miles from ground zero, a mere 3 weeks after the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and blasphemously declares that the U.S. government orchestrated the attacks to reverse the declining American economy, as he did last year, we will stand up for those brave men and women who lost their lives that day and every day since fighting for freedom. And when he stands at the UN and celebrates the 10th anniversary of the Durban hate fest that was an anti-Semitic rant against Israel, we will stand up for the freedom and democracy that Israel represents, the freedom and democracy that Ahmadinejad so brutally represses in his own country. That's going to be our role just tomorrow, and I know that you will look forward to standing in strong opposition to those statements from one who wishes to see Israel wiped off the map, one who could probably be tried for incitement to genocide for his statements. You will stand with me, as you always have, in opposition to the rhetoric, the hateful rhetoric that we will be forced to listen to tomorrow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deutsch, for pointing that out, because unfortunately, I said before that the UN has been a kangaroo court against Israel time and time again. Israel cannot get a fair shake in the United Nations, and I do hope that we are able to block the votes in the Security Council, where the United States has said that they will, the Obama administration has said that the President will do a veto of any kind of resolution, and I hope that it won't even come to that, because I hope that they do not get the requisite number of votes to even pass it. And then the Palestinians might then go to the General Assembly, or they say they are going to do that. And while the General Assembly cannot admit a Palestinian state, it can upgrade their status, which would allow them to run around and harass Israeli leaders in the different international courts. I just think the UN better be careful. It sits in my home town of New York, and we have always been proud that the UN is in New York. But I think the UN is on the basis of discrediting itself very, very badly. You know, there was Resolution 242, which talked about land for peace in the Middle East. I would say that the Palestinians, by trying to get recognition unilaterally in the UN, are repudiating the land for peace. They're certainly repudiating the Oslo Accords, where it said that both states have to sit down, the Palestinians and the Israelis have to sit down, hammer out an agreement. And as I mentioned before, it even repudiates the very basis of the initial partition of Palestine in 1947 and 48 into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And you know, we talk about the Palestinian refugees. They have been used as pawns by the Palestinian leadership and, frankly, by all the other Arab states in the world. And we ought to mention this because it's very, very important. Jewish refugees from North Africa and all over the world, from Europe, from all over the world, came to Israel and were integrated into Israeli society through the years. The Palestinian refugees could have and should have been integrated in the various Arab countries. But the Arab leaders decided to leave them in these horrendous conditions, in these camps, to use the Palestinian refugees as pawns in the Palestinian camps. It wasn't done by the Israelis. It was done by the Palestinians themselves and by the Arab nations themselves to use them as political pawns. So I think we should look at the people who are really suffering here and saying why they're suffering. They're suffering because they've had a leadership that has failed them for more than 60 years. So I'm very proud of the United States of America. I'm proud of our country for standing up for freedom. I'm proud of our country for standing with Israel. I'm proud that the President said the bond between Israel is unbreakable. We have to understand that this is not a fight between two groups that are sort of equal in being concerned about democracy. Israel shares our values. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel, what's important to Israel, is important to the United States. And that's why we have to stand with Israel, because if we don't do it, nobody else will. We've shown time and time and time again that the international community, particularly the United Nations, is biased against Israel, and unless the United States stands squarely with Israel, Israel will never get a fair shake. So I am proud that we are doing that now at the United Nations. I am proud that we have taken a stand. I am proud of this Congress on a bipartisan basis for taking a pro-Israel stand. And the United States and I would say this to the people of Israel, will always stand with our friends and allies, Israel, who care for the basic human rights and concerns in democracy and democratic values that we care about as well. So as we see this unfolding, I would just say to the Palestinians, if you really want your state, if you really want a two-state solution, which I believe you are entitled, then sit down with Israel, face to face, across a negotiating table, no preconditions, and talk peace. The Israelis are ready to do it. We're still waiting for the Palestinians. Thank you, Mr. Deutsch.
And I thank you very much, Mr. Engel, for your passionate words.